Okay, what's up YouTube? This is Shaman Time, and today I have a video on cruisers and corvettes of the Ottoman Empire from 1881 until the end of World War I in 1918. Now, between 1881 and 1918, the Ottoman Empire actually fielded a variety of steam cruisers, or cruisers that ran on, at that time, were considered modern steam engines. So we're going to go over some of the Ottoman cruisers and corvettes of the Ottoman Navy leading up to and towards the end of World War I. So let's begin. Now, the first cruiser or first corvette on this list is the Ottoman training corvette or training cruiser Haibatnuma from 1881. Now, this ship was actually constructed between 1881 and 1895, which means that it took the Ottomans a very long time to construct this one warship. Now, this ship had a displacement of 1,958 tons. Its main armament was one 149mm SKL-25 main gun. It was also fitted with six 120mm 4.7-inch L-25 secondary guns and four 47mm 1.9-inch L-40 secondary or third line anti-torpedo boat guns. Now, this vessel had no armor, its speed was 12 knots, and it had a crew of 190. Now, the Haibatnuma actually launched in 1895 and spent most of its life as a training corvette or training cruiser. Now, this vessel is one of those strange Ottoman warships that sits between the line of corvette and cruiser. So it's kind of both warships, but it is normally listed as a corvette, but is sometimes listed as a cruiser. Now, this ship actually didn't serve very long. The Haibatnuma served from 1895 until only 1907, and it spent pretty much all of its life as a training cruiser or a training corvette. Now, this was the Ottomans' first attempt at constructing a armored corvette or a armored protected cruiser. This is why its armor thickness is usually not listed. So there you have it. This was the first corvette slash training cruiser, the Ottoman warship Haibatnuma, constructed between 1881 and 1895. Now, the next Ottoman cruiser on this list is actually a rather strange type of warship, and that ship is the Llaves from 1896. The Llaves was a Ottoman unprotected cruiser that was constructed between 1892 and launched in 1896. Now, the unprotected cruiser is a strange class of warship that actually originates both in Spain and Germany. Now, back in the 1880s, both Spain and Germany designed or developed a class of warship that we now know as the unprotected cruisers. These are basically cruisers that were constructed with little to no armor, and they were designed to have maximum speed and firepower but without any real protection. So these are basically like protected cruisers but without any protection. So the Ottoman Empire constructed their first unprotected cruiser, the Llaves, in between 1892 and 1896. The Llaves' displacement was 1,313 tons. This ship's main armament was three 173mm 7.9-inch SKL-25 main guns. It also had a secondary armament of six 120mm 4.7-inch L-25 secondary guns and six 47mm 1.9-inch L-40 third line anti-torpedo boat guns. Plus, this vessel was also fitted with two 14-inch 356mm torpedo tubes. This unprotected cruiser had no armor, as you can imagine. Believe it or not, this ship was actually constructed with wood and iron, and it had a speed of just 12 knots and a crew of 150. Now, the Llaves is actually listed as a reduced version of the Haibatnuma. So this is basically a smaller version of the Haibatnuma, but this vessel was constructed mostly of wood and iron. And this ship spent most of its life as a stationary training cruiser for the Ottoman Navy. The Llaves served in the Ottoman Navy from 1896 until she was stricken in 1908. In 1908, the ship was decommissioned and sold for scrap, thus ending the life of the Llaves, the first Ottoman unprotected cruiser from 1896. The next class of Ottoman warship on this list is a very strange class of warship also, and that is the Hause Class. Now, the Hause Class consisted of two warships, the Ottoman ship Hause and its sister ships Llaves. And these ships were constructed between 1892 and 1894, but weren't completed until 1896. Now, these ships are listed in Turkey as sloops of war. Now, if you don't know what a sloop is a very strange type of warship also. It is kind of like a very small cruiser. It could also be considered a torpedo cruiser in a sense, but some sloops also resemble corvettes, or in some cases large torpedo boats, or visos in some cases. Or viso is another type of warship that sits in a very blurred line between the cruiser and corvette class. So the Hause class is listed as sloops of wars, but also they are also sometimes listed as both cruisers and corvettes. And these ships had a displacement of just 643 tons. Their main armament were two 120mm 4.7-inch L25 C model 1878 main guns. They were also armed with three 37mm 1.5-inch L40 model 1891 secondary guns, and they were also fitted with two 17.7-inch 140mm torpedo tubes. These vessels also had no armor, and their speeds were 14 knots respectively, and these ships had a small crew of just 82. This is why these ships fall into a very blurred line. And they are technically light cruisers or torpedo cruisers, but they are also corvettes / sloops of wars also. And these ships served the Ottoman Navy from 1896 until 1917. Another strange fact about these two Hause class warships is that the secondary ship, the Llaves, the sister ship of the lead ship Hause, was decommissioned strangely in 1909, and this was a few years before the Balkan Wars kicked off. Now, the ship was decommissioned and sold for scrap for some reason, but I would have to estimate that it was probably because the Ottomans were kind of bad at maintaining some of their warships, especially their heavier ships like battleships and cruisers. But in 1916, the Hause herself was also disarmed, and later on in 1917, she was recommissioned as a survey vessel, and she served in this capacity until the end of World War I. The Hause actually survived World War I and wasn't decommissioned completely until 1932, where she was finally disarmed again and sold for scrap, thus ending the career of the Hause class of sloop of war, which could also be considered a type of corvette or torpedo cruiser. Now let's move on to an even stranger class of Ottoman warship, and it's also one of my favorite class of warships designed by the Ottoman Empire, and that is the Pig-Eye Sevgit class from 1907. The Pig-Eye Sevgit class were a class of two torpedo cruisers that are also sometimes referred to as torpedo gunboats or small cruisers in general. Now, these two ships had a displacement of 787 tons, which is pretty small for a cruiser. Their main armament were four 105mm L40 main guns. They were also fitted with six 57mm 2.2-inch L30 secondary guns and two 37mm 1.5-inch anti-torpedo boat guns. Their third line armament was three 14-inch 356mm millimeter torpedo tubes. Their armor thickness was basically non-existent, as these warships were even lightlier armed than the standard light cruiser. They had a speed of 21 knots, or 39 kilometers per hour, or 24 miles per hour, and they had a crew of 105. Now, the Peak Eye Sefket class were actually constructed between 1906 and 1907. If you remember, 1906 was the year where HMS Dreadnought launched, the first steam turbine-powered battleship. These ships were actually laid down during the same period of time that the HMS Dreadnought was laid down, and they were actually constructed in Germany, and these ships were actually fitted with the old triple expansion steam engine. Now, the Peak Eye Sefket class consisted of 2 warships, the cruiser Peak Eye Sefket herself and her sister ship Berk Eye Sefket. And these ships served in the Ottoman Navy for a very long time. They served from 1907 until 1953, which is the beginning or in the early Cold War era. Now, during World War I, these were some of the, fastest warships in the Ottoman Navy. You have to remember, during World War I, the Ottoman Navy was largely antiquated. The fastest warships in the Ottoman navies were cruisers like the Peak Eye Sefket class, along with other more modern light cruisers and battle cruisers like the Breslau and the SMS Gubin, which were renamed Medili and Llaves Saint Selim, for example. So in World War I, the Peak Eye Sefket class were very needed by the Ottoman Navy. Keep in mind, the Ottomans also had a ginormous fleet of old ironclad ships that were reconstructed into pre-dreadnought style battleships and coastal defense ships, and I did a video on that last year. So the Peak Eye Sefket class is kind of one of my favorite Ottoman warships that rarely gets any mention. Now, these 2 ships actually did a lot of combat, saw a lot of combat during the First World War. For example, in 1915, the Berk Eye Sefket was actually hit by a Russian naval mine, and in the same year, 1915, the Peak Eye Sefket was actually torpedoed by the British submarine HMS E-11, but both ships managed to survive and were laid up until the year 1917, getting their repairs so they can return back into service. After 1917, the ships re-entered service, and by that time, a large number of the Ottoman battleships had actually been sunk. For example, the Ottoman battleships Masudi, the Ottoman battleships Hayreddin Barbarossa, and her sister ship Turgut Reis were all sunk during the years 1914 and 1915. And by 1917, the battlecruiser Llaves Saint Selim had also suffered heavy damage in a minefield incident between 1917 and 1918. So by 1917 and 1918, the Peak Eye Sefket class, these 2 cruisers were kind of the most advanced warships left in the Ottoman Navy towards the end of World War I. This is why when the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918 and was replaced with the state of Turkey, these ships remained in Turkish service long after World War I, and they actually stayed in service past the time period of World War II and actually served all the way up until 1953, where both ships were finally decommissioned for the final time and sold for scrap, thus ending the history of the Ottoman Peak Eye Sefket class of torpedo cruisers, and one of my favorite class of Ottoman warships that never really gets any mention. So let's move along to another Ottoman warship, and one of the more famous warships that I'm pretty sure many of you have heard of when it comes to Ottoman cruisers, and that is the Ottoman cruiser Messedai from 1903. Now, the Messedai was a Ottoman protected cruiser that was constructed between 1901 and 1903. She had a displacement of 3,967 tons. Her main armament was two 152mm L45 Krupp main guns. She was also fitted with 8 120mm L45 secondary guns and 6 47mm L50 Vickers guns from the UK. She also had 6 37mm 1.5-inch anti-torpedo boat guns, and she was also fitted with Messidai also had a torpedo armament of two 457mm torpedo tubes. Her armor thickness was also 38 to 102 millimeters. Now, the Messidai actually served as a protected cruiser in the Ottoman Navy, and as a protected cruiser or a fast warship, she had a very lengthy service career in the Ottoman Navy, and she also had a very infamous service career within the Ottoman Navy. For example, during the First and Second Balkan War between 1912 and 1913, the Messidai actually participated in the two major naval battles that happened between the Ottoman Navy and the Greek Navy, and these two naval battles were the battles of Ili on the 16th of December 1912 and the Battle of Lemnos on the 18th of January 1913. During those two battles, Messidai actually suffered a large amount of damage inflicted on her by the Greek Navy, but she managed to survive the Balkan Wars. And during the First World War, Messidai also took part in the offensive against the Russian Navy during the battles of the Black Sea. For example, on the 3rd of April 1915, Messidai actually participated in the shelling of Odessa, but she later struck a Russian naval mine about 15 nautical miles away from the city of Odessa, in which 26 of her crew were killed. The ship later sank in the shallows and was later salvaged by the Russian Navy on the 31st of May 1915, where she was later renamed the Russian cruiser Prut. Messidai actually served in the Russian Navy from 1916 until she was recaptured by the Ottoman Empire's ally Germany on the 5th of December 1918. Then she was later returned to the Turks under her former name Messidai. But for a short period of time, she actually served in the Russian Navy as the Russian cruiser Prut during the time period that she was captured by the Russians. After World War I, Messidai was actually laid up until about 1919. Then she was laid up again until 1927. But in 1927, she was repaired and refurbished and served in the newly formed Turkish Navy up until the year 1952, where she was finally sold for scrap sometime between 1952 and 1956, thus ending the legacy of the legendary Turkish protection cruiser Messidai. Which brings us to a even more legendary Ottoman cruiser, and that is the Ottoman cruiser Hamadai from 1907. Now, the Hamadai was actually a protection cruiser that was ordered from the UK from the Vickers Armstrong Company in 1902. She was constructed between 1902 and completed in 1904, where she was commissioned into the Ottoman Navy. Hamadai's displacement was 3,904 tons. She had a main armament consisting of two 150mm QF L45 Krupp main guns. She also had 8 120mm QF L45 secondary guns, 6 47mm QF L50 third line guns, and 6 37mm anti-aircraft / anti-torpedo boat guns. She also had a torpedo armament of 2 457mm torpedo tubes, and she also carried racks for up to 70 naval mines. Her armor thickness was also 38 to 102 millimeters, and she had a crew of 302 sailors. This made the Ottoman cruiser Hamadai one of the strongest warships in the Ottoman Navy, but she was also one of the more modern warships. Remember, the Ottoman Navy did have a large fleet of antiquated ironclad battleships and ironclad coastal defense ships, but Hamadai, along with Messidai, were some of the more advanced warships in the Ottoman Navy from the beginning of the 19th century until at least the middle of the First World War. Now, the Hamadai actually fought in the Balkan Wars also, and this was between 1912 and 1913. In November 1912, the Hamadai was actually torpedoed in the middle of a naval battle with the smaller Bulgarian Navy, and this was known as the Battle of Kaliakra. During the Battle of Kaliakra, the Hamadai actually encountered an entire flotilla of Bulgarian torpedo boats being led by the Bulgarian torpedo boat Drazaki. And it was during this battle that the Drazaki actually torpedoed the Hamadai. Hamadai managed to escape during the battle, but she later sank when she returned back to Turkey. Now, just like Masidi, the Hamadai also had a legendary naval career in the Ottoman Navy. On the 27th of November 1912, the Ottoman Navy actually clashed with the smaller Bulgarian Navy. And during this time period, or during this battle, the cruiser Hamadai was actually torpedoed by a group of torpedo boats led by the Bulgarian torpedo boat Drazaki. During this battle, Drazaki managed to land at least one or two hits on the Hamadai, crippling the cruiser and forcing her to retreat, where she later sank in the Turkish Dardanelles, but she was eventually salvaged by the end of that war and put back into service. In World War I, Hamidi actually served as the cruiser flagship of the Ottoman Navy, or the flagship of the Ottoman cruiser forces operating both in the Bosporus and in the Turkish Dardanelles. Eventually, by the end of World War I, she was actually laid up, but luckily she survived the war, unlike many of the heavy Ottoman warships. For example, the battleships Hayreddin Barbarossa, Turgut Reis, Masudai, and a bunch of other warships, including the newer cruiser Midilli, which had been sunk only a few months earlier in 1918. After World War I, Hamadai was actually laid up until 1925. In 1926, she was actually repaired and refurbished and modernized by the new Turkish Navy and re-entered service, where she later served all the way up until 1949, making her one of the oldest warships to survive the Ottoman Navy, along with her sister ship Masidi, and along with the Hause Class Corvettes mentioned earlier. Still pale in comparison to the service history of the Peak-E Soviet class that I mentioned earlier on the list. So that was basically it for the cruiser Hamadai. In fact, she wasn't actually broken up until 1966. So she actually stayed at a Turkish shipyard or scrapyard for a long time before actually being broken up. Now, I actually wish they had preserved this warship, but unfortunately that never happened, and the Hamidi was scrapped eventually in 1966, thus ending the history of the legendary Ottoman cruiser. Which brings us to the most modern cruiser in the Ottoman Navy, and that is the Ottoman cruiser Midilli, which was originally named the German light cruiser Breslau. Now, Breslau was actually constructed between 1910 and 1914, and she entered service in August 1914. But during that same time period, World War I was about to begin, so the Germans decided to sell Breslau along with the battle cruiser Gubin to the Ottoman Navy in order to get the Ottomans to join the Central Powers. During that time period, Midilli or Breslau was transferred to the Ottoman Navy, where she was renamed the Ottoman cruiser Midilli. Now, Midilli's displacement was 4,564 tons, or 5,281 tons full load. Her main armament was 12 105mm L45 guns, and she was also fitted with two 500mm torpedo tubes and had two naval racks for 120 naval mines. She had a crew of 354. Her maximum speed was 27 knots total, and she had a armor thickness of between 18 and 100 millimeters, making her the most armored warship, or the most armored of the cruisers within the Ottoman Navy, with the exception of the battle cruiser Llaves, formerly known as the SMS Gubin, which was a battle cruiser purchased from Germany. Now, Midilli actually served in the Ottoman Navy as the flagship of the Ottoman Navy, believe it or not. That was until the battlecruiser Llaves Sultan Selim, formerly Gubin, was made the flagship later on. Midilli also had a legendary naval career. For example, on the 22nd of July, 1915, Midilli actually ran into the Russian battleship Emperor Maria, and where she, along with the battlecruiser Llaves, actually exchanged fire. And during this time period, she actually took splinter damage from a battleship, but managed to survive at least that battle. But during the same day, she actually ran into a minefield in the Sea of Azov in 1915. She was salvaged and eventually repaired, but her luck eventually ran out. And on January the 20th, 1918, Midilli struck another mine, this time laid by the British off the coast of Imbros. And this time, her stern was actually blown off, and she sank in less than 30 minutes, taking at least 2/3 of her 370-man crew, thus ending the career of the Ottoman cruiser Midilli, formerly the German cruiser SMS Breslau. Which leads us to the final Ottoman cruiser on this list, the largest Ottoman cruiser, and that is the Ottoman cruiser Llaves Sultan Selim, which was originally known as the German battle cruiser SMS Gubin. Now, the SMS Gubin was actually laid down in 1909, and she was completed in August 1914, during the same month that World War I was about to begin. And her displacement was 25,400 tons. She had a main armament of 5 283 millimeter L50 11-inch main guns. She also had a secondary battery of 12 149 millimeter L45 secondary guns and 10 88 millimeter L45 C09 third line guns, and she was also fitted with 4 500 millimeter torpedo tubes. Her armor thickness was massive, between 25 and 270 millimeters on her belt, but she also had an additional 350 millimeters on her conning tower. The ship had a speed of 25.5 knots, and she had a crew of 1,053. Now, when the ship was launched, Germany was already in the middle of negotiating the Ottoman Empire into joining the Central Powers and what would eventually be known as World War I. And in August 1914, the same month that she was being launched, she was sold to the Ottoman Navy, where she was eventually renamed the Llaves Sultan Selim, and eventually became the flagship of the Ottoman Navy, along with being the most powerful flagship or warship in the Ottoman Navy. On November the 18th, 1914, the battlecruiser Llaves Sultan Selim encountered the Russian battleship Yezdovai in what would be known as the Battle of Cape Surik. During this battle, the Llaves actually received several hits from 305 millimeter shells from the Russian battleship, along with 150 millimeter casemate rounds. She was damaged by this battleship. She ran into naval mines later on after encountering this Russian battleship again in November 1914. On January the 20th, 1918, while sailing off the coast of the Turkish Dardanelles, she again ran into 3 naval mines and eventually ran aground, where she was later salvaged later in that year. But for the most part, the Llaves actually led several assaults against the Russian near and around the straits of both the Bosphorus and the Turkish Dardanelles, at least on the Eastern Front. And during that time period, she largely remained undamaged, but she did hit several naval mines throughout the war, which led her to being laid up for repairs multiple times. But eventually, World War I was coming to a close, and on the 9th of November 1918, the German crews of the former battle cruiser Gubin, now the Llaves Sultan Selim, were ordered to abandon the ship. And the ship was now crewed by Turkish sailors who pretty much didn't know what they were doing. So when World War I came to an end, the ship was actually laid up in Izmit, which is a naval facility in Turkey. And she stayed there until 1925. In 1925, Turkey was now an independent state, no longer occupied by the Allied powers, and she was eventually refurbished between 1925 and 1928, and again in 1930, eventually serving as the flagship of the Turkish Navy. And she served as the flagship of the Turkish Navy for a long period of time, throughout World War II also, until she was finally decommissioned in November 1954. In 1954, she was laid up in Gokok, which is a region in Turkey where they also store a lot of the decommissioned vessels. In 1963, the government of Turkey actually tried to sell the Llaves Sultan Selim, formerly the SMS Gubin, back to West Germany to be turned into a museum ship. But in 1970, the Germans eventually rejected the offer, and in 1973, the Llaves Sultan Selim, formerly the SMS Gubin, the last surviving battleship built before and used during World War I, was finally sold for scrap, thus ending the legacy of what many would consider to be the most powerful cruiser to ever serve in the Ottoman Navy and in the Turkish Navy. And that's basically it for these Ottoman cruisers, with the Llaves Sultan Selim being the most powerful of the Ottoman cruisers, even though battle cruisers are sometimes considered just, lighter battleships, but battle cruisers are still, cruisers at the end of the day. If I had to pick my favorite of these warships, I would say the Hause Class is my favorite of these, just because how small and bizarre they are, and the fact that they served for so long. These ships of these size normally don't serve for, dang near 50 years. But the Hause Class did serve for that long. And that's why it's my favorite class of Ottoman cruisers. But what is your favorite cruiser on this list? I also like the Llaves Sultan Selim as probably my favorite Ottoman warship as an individual warship outside of a class. Although it is part of a class of German battle cruisers, so, technically. But what are your favorite of these Ottoman cruisers? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off. And if you want, you can support me on Patreon. But you really don't have to if you don't want to. But again, this was J-Man Time signing off.